about myself, I'll start recently. So I've been with the agency for 3.5 years, and unfortunately soon to be leaving and moving on to another position. But I think it's going to go very smoothly. I have every confidence in that. And so, let's see, before that, I was with the Tahoe Forest Hospital and got my master's in public health at UNR. I've been in the area for a bit over 7 years, and I'm originally from Santa Cruz. My background's in public health, so I used to work at the Needle Exchange program in Santa Cruz. I have a very strong interest in social justice and everything related to equity is very important to me. So that's a little bit of my perspective and the lens that I see my work in. That being said, today we're going to be talking about what the children's program does, and that includes what the qualifications are to be in the children's program, working with folks that have experienced different types of abuse that are under 18. It's a very sensitive topic. I want to be sensitive to that. It can be triggering, and looking at the amount of people in this room, I'm confident that several of us have experienced many of the things in here. So I just want people to be aware of that and think of yourselves, take care of yourselves. So if you need to step out, if something's feeling difficult or not like something you are ready to listen to, want to listen to, feels uncomfortable, then feel free to take a break, step out, take care of yourself. And if it's something that you'd like to talk about later, one-on-one in private, then we can do that as well. But I just wanted to preface with that because it is an important part, and it's an important part of doing this work, regardless of working with kids, working with other folks that are experiencing different types of trauma. For those of us that have experienced it, can be triggering, and for those that haven't, right? Just being very empathetic, it can bring up a lot of feelings, and it can be easy for those of us that have a lot of feelings to kind of go into that place. So having good boundaries is a big part of being able to stay in this field and being able to be effective in the work that we're doing, and being able to help the folks that we're working with. So I'll go ahead and get started. It looks like most folks have name tags, so we'll just leave it there. We'll go around if that's okay. And if there's questions, feel free to stop me. Depending on how we do a time, I might kind of keep going and ask them to wait until we're done with the slide before I answer questions. So since there's a lot of us, if you could just raise your hands when we have a question or something to say, okay? Any questions about that? So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go over some definitions, different types of sexual abuse. So I broke it out into 2 different types of abuse, the sexual abuse and then other forms of child abuse. I did that specifically for our grant requirements, not because anything special or different, just because those are the things that they're requesting. And we look at different forms of abuse just as they are. So we're going to talk about those, the warning signs, the effects of sexual abuse, and then prevention of, we're going to have a little short break in the middle, and then we'll go into other types of child abuse. So witnessing domestic violence, neglect, and treatment, what the children's program does. Okay. So what is child abuse? So this is kind of the working definition of what we go by. Child abuse is when a parent or caregiver, through action or failing to act. So the words that we use are important as well, because those are the things that we're looking at, and that's when we may be making a report. That's when we're considering what is occurring within a family. So whether through action or failing to act, causes injury, death, emotional harm, or risk of serious harm to a child. So there's many different forms: maltreatment, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, and emotional abuse. Do folks have questions about that? Okay. So I like to start with definitions because it's important that we're all sharing the same basis, same platform, because otherwise there might be different ideas, different interpretations, and things like that. That being said, those are also important things that we're doing when we're working with participants in the community, is making sure that the language that we're using is shared. So if I'm saying one thing and someone else is using the same language, but they're meaning something totally different, we might come to different conclusions, and then we might be having two very different conversations. So if I share with a community member, I'm a mandated reporter, I have to report child abuse, and they're not aware that witnessing domestic violence is included, they might not be aware that they just divulged information to me that I have to report. So those kind of things, that's why it can be important, because it can change the relationship that we're having with each other and the things that we're talking about. I didn't even notice it, sorry. So child sexual abuse is any interaction when the child is being used for sexual stimulation of the child or the perpetrator or observer by an adult, older child, or adolescent. So that can include different ages of folks that are still minors, can include adults, and that's what we're looking at when we're talking about sexual abuse. So there's several different types of sexual abuse. So statutory rape, I would say, is something that we see, well, I would say we see all forms of these things within the children's program. And statutory rape is an interesting one. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Essentially what statutory rape is more about the legalities of a minor having sex with someone who's older than 18, who's over the age of 18, right? And that can be with consent or without consent. So under the law will say that children cannot consent to sex. Now what that means is there's a bunch of different things within that, okay? So different age groups can. So if they're saying that children can't consent with adults, then implicitly they're saying that children can consent with other children. So they've made the laws a bit more strict so that there are actual guidelines of that, and we'll talk a little bit about that next. So child molestation, sexual contact between an adult and someone under 12. And that can happen from different relationships. We know that that happens most commonly with folks that know a family. Pedophilia, I'd say that that's not something we typically work with because we're not working with folks that are perpetrating crimes. We're working with the children themselves. So we don't always know who the other person is in the children's program. So it's a psychiatric disorder. It's something that's pretty interesting. I'd say there's not a ton of information on it. There's not a lot of options for folks to be rehabilitated, to get support, to get help if they do experience pedophilia. And it is a psychiatric condition, so people can be diagnosed with that, and they can go through a process of getting treatment and things like that. Incest, so sexual contact between persons who are so closely related that their marriage is illegal, so that would be the parents with their children, can be cousins, can be siblings, different immediate family members, and then child sex trafficking, so anyone under 18 who are commercially sexually exploited. And we'll talk a bit more about what that actually means. So there's some specific language there, as well as specific laws around what that looks like. And as you know, as the law states with statutory rape, folks under 18 can't technically consent. So what does that look like with sex trafficking? So with statutory rape, has the district attorney come into the classes here?
Not yet.
No, not yet? Okay. So I won't get too specific, but I'll share a little bit about the criminal justice system because it's important when we're looking at statutory rape. And the reason for that is when we're looking at the laws, they're different by state. So California state's different than Nevada state. In California, it is folks that are under the age of 18. And actually, I'll go to the next page and then I'll come back as well. So this is the sheet of, you can see here, there's actually a whole grid of what the different ages are and what's legal, what's not legal, and what's reportable and what's not reportable. So as a mandated reporter, this is important for those of us in the room to know when someone's disclosing any sort of sexual relationship with someone. So it's going to be dependent on what the ages are. It gets a little confusing because when we're looking at these laws, we're looking at where it's taking place, so California or Nevada, not the residency. So if a California 17-year-old person goes to Nevada, that's going to be different. They're going over there to have sex with somebody, to be in a relationship with them who's older. That's going to be a different consent than it is in California. As well as when we're looking at those things, if there's consent taking place, then, which implicitly there is, right? Statutory rape. If there's not consent, it's just rape. So with statutory rape, we're kind of implying that the minor has consented to this relationship. However, the law is saying, well, you're not old enough to be in a sexual relationship. When it comes to pressing charges, it doesn't mean that there's law enforcement out there looking for 16-year-old children, youth that are having sex with people who are older. What it means is if there's a situation that arises where it becomes more coercive and looks more like an abusive situation, where this young person really isn't consenting, then that's when they start to look at pressing charges and things like that. Additionally, who's reporting this information? So when we're looking at statutory rape, oftentimes I would say it's the parents or people that are upset by the relationship that are going to be pressing charges or calling law enforcement saying, you know what, there's this person who's having a sexual relationship with somebody who's much older. And that's when the information gets shared with law enforcement. So the reason why I asked if the district attorney had come in is then to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system. So that information goes to law enforcement, and this is how most criminal justice information kind of works. Goes to law enforcement, they open an investigation. They'll take a report, they see if this is enough information for them to open an investigation, or they might say, not enough information. It might be me saying, you know, I know my neighbor, Jack, down the street is 15, I saw this lady who's way older, I'm not okay with it, you need to go look at it. Most likely they'll say, okay, thanks for your concern, you know, and I'm not going to pursue that. Because there's not enough information. However, if they see that there's a warranted amount of information for an investigation, then they're going to start asking questions, open that investigation, and once they feel that there's enough information, they hand it off to the district attorney. Because law enforcement doesn't press charges, the district attorney does. So then the district attorney gets to review that information and decide if it's enough to press charges or not, if they're even interested in it. So in my experience within the children's program, I would say it's not very common for them to press charges. And the reason for that is a lot of different things. They don't feel like it's a large enough offense, particularly if the minor has consented. If it's more, they're really looking at the severity of the situation. If there is a significant age gap, if there were other factors involved, domestic violence, and maybe the minor is saying they still are consenting, but there were things that were harmful in nature in that relationship, then they might look at pressing charges and they'll probably look more at that. Of course, that's always at their discretion, so we never really know what the outcome is. And that's the kind of information that we're sharing with participants that are calling us for information, that are sharing their concerns. So school counselors that are sharing concerns, or teens or youth that are calling us with their concerns. That's the kind of information we can help them to kind of guide them with understanding what to expect. Also within that, part of why this law exists, and this is something that we share with participants as well, is really to protect people. Right? So folks, and that's the whole purpose of what the children's program is about, is folks that are 0 to 18 are a vulnerable population. They can be easily coerced. They're under the law, largely dependent on other people. And so as a society, that's kind of how we view folks that are under 18. And so within that, it's our obligation to protect them, to provide them with support, to provide them with these regulations that are protecting them from making decisions or engaging in relationships that might not be fully consensual. So that being said, that's kind of a bit about statutory rape, what that looks like through the criminal justice system. Yeah.
So is it not considered or statutory rape if both of the parties are under the age of consent, or it is?
So that's what this little diagram is a little bit about. And this is more for mandated reporting. So yes and no.
Because I just remember people that I went to high school with were caught having sex in a car, and they were both, I'm pretty sure they were both under 18, but they got in trouble.
So they get
I forget. I think so.
And you know,
Maybe, yeah. I thought they were talking about statutory rape, so maybe, yeah. I don't know the details exactly, but I just, so
there are reporting guidelines, and also to answer that question, like a little bit about who's prosecuting, who's pressing charges.
Right.
It's largely dependent on so many different factors that's why when I share information, I say, you know, we never know the outcome. We don't know what's going to happen because we don't know. I mean, they're just people essentially that are implementing these regulations. So district attorneys are all individuals that have their own experiences, that have their own biases. Same with law enforcement. So that's why that information is going to look really different. So depending on what community you're coming from, they may take things more seriously than others. They may have had a personal experience, and so they prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. Because under the law, it's always at their discretion. So they get to choose that. So there's so many different things that they take into account. Things like if an individual has a criminal background. So and that's also similar to CPS reporting as well. So we don't always know what their background is. So maybe this is the 6th time something has happened with another 14-year-old person, and this 17-year-old person now they're starting to feel like this person is taking advantage of other folks. And there is maybe coercion and concern for community members. So maybe now the district attorney is going to prosecute something. So there's all those things that come into play that we don't necessarily know. So within this is a chart of, you know, we talked about statutory rape, and that itself is not a mandated report. Mandated report, sorry. As mandated reporters, we would not have to report that, depending on the age. So if there's a 16-year-old who's calling and saying they're having sex with a 17-year-old, we don't have to report that. Now, any type of coerced sex with a minor is reportable. So that's that difference.
Do you think that it's like an add-on charge? You see it as like like another charge? When they have someone in already, they're just going to tack this on to try to bolster a case against a certain person? Or if it's just like you're saying, statutory rape isn't really something that
I'd say that's
prosecuting directly.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a better question for the district attorney. It just, I have pretty much, in my limited experience, I haven't seen that happen. But for us, we're mostly working with folks who are the victim of that specific crime.
I would say from different classes that I've had with district attorney, and I definitely think you should remember that question and bring it up because I would like to know the answer to that. But they have talked about, if somebody has done multiple crimes, and if you can't get them on this one, that they'll pursue the other ones to try to get them in jail or on probation longer.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to see what they say.
And I think it's dependent on those individuals. I know I've sat through a meeting where the district attorney was saying, well, I don't want him to be a registered sex offender. And she's sharing that with the victim, with somebody who has essentially, it's questionable whether there was consent or not. So I'm not sure. So they didn't pursue rape charges because it wasn't clear if it was consensual or not, but there were obviously some very questionable things. And that was her reason why she didn't want to prosecute, because she didn't want him to be a registered sex offender. So there's also things to consider, is like the criminal justice system is not really set up to consider the victim's feelings or their perspective or support them. And that's a big part of the role that we fill and the role that we play in working with folks, is that they're largely going through this system that is overlooking a lot of what they're experiencing. And so what we can do is provide them support and guidance through this experience. And there's also victims advocates who can do that. They're located an hour away. So that's where we come in. So when you see, so this chart I put in here, I think it's just interesting and helpful, something to think about. And it illustrates that there's just so much gray area in mandated reporting and statutory rape. So these are the age differences. You can see the J means judgment, so this is the age of the partner, age of the youth. And then the M is mandated. So somebody who's 20 who is having a sexual relationship with someone who's 12, that's a mandated report. And somebody who's 16 who's having a sexual relationship with someone who's 12, that's a mandated report. But then we go a little bit further, and you get these J's, which means use your judgment. So in those situations, when they say that, you can call and report. And again, that's assuming consent on both parties. So when there is no consent, that is a mandated report. And that is not statutory rape, that's rape. As I think you guys have already covered that one.
So statutory rape is when, most likely mandated, is when it's coerced, like a consent is coerced from the victim?
Can be.
More often.
So with coercion, I'd say that's a gray area. Under our working definition, that's closer to rape itself, right? If somebody's coerced into sex, then that's I would say rape, depending on what that coercion looks like. Under the law, again, that's where these gray areas come into play, where what our definition isn't necessarily something that the district attorney is using or that they feel like they can prosecute something with. So, well, for us, when they're sharing something, that might be something where, we can talk to them a bit about what consent looks like and things like that, but it's not always something that'll be pursued. And when it comes to a minor, if there is coercion, then it is reportable.
So that maybe like falls under the umbrella of like your softball coach who's 25, you're 17, you get in a relationship, you say yes, but the law says you're not old enough to say yes to that.
Absolutely.
That's where it's coming in.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That would definitely be reported. And within that example, I would say it'd be almost more than coercion. Now you're starting to look at sex trafficking. Because then somebody's in a position of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so this person, what's going on that there's coercion? What is the softball coach saying? Is there an exchange of privileges? If there is, then that's bordering on child sexual exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a significant, that's a really bad.
Yeah.
Even in Nevada, where the law is 16,
Yes.
that age gap is significant enough that it.
Yes, and I will be honest, I'm less familiar with reporting in Nevada, and they tend to be a bit looser with what their restrictions are. So, always, whenever I have questions, it's always just call and ask, and they can give you that answer. Okay, any other questions about statutory rape before we move on? Okay. So child molestation. So that's the biggest indicator for this is the age. What's the age difference between the molester and the child? If it's 5 years, a 14-year-old can sexually touching a younger person would be an example. So it depends on the age difference of what encompasses molestation. And what we see typically within the organization can be within family members, people that are within close contact of that minor of that young child and folks that know the kiddo, people that know them. That could also include two kids that are curious with each other. So it doesn't, I'd say in my experience of working with folks, it's not always harmful intent with child molestation, depending on the ages of the kids. And of course, that doesn't always mean that it's not harmful. But I'd say that that intent is not always there. And then there are other times when it is. And there's young folks in the community that have had their own traumatic experiences that have unfortunately kind of played into the role of sexual predation. And so they kind of mature into that. So that does happen as well. And
Predasia?
huh?
Predasia?
Predation, like a sexual predator.
Predation. It's like a mentality.
No, just that like they're preying on other people.
Oh.
So in certain circumstances that may happen. I wouldn't say. Again, it's based on the law, so it kind of runs the gamut of what's happening there. Oh,
Predation,
predation.
Predation.
like a predator,
Okay.
and the noun would be predation.
Okay. Ready?
No, thank you for asking. So pedophilia. And so again, this is a psychiatric disorder, an abnormal or unnatural attraction, the fantasy or act of sexual activity with prepubescent children. So under this term, they're usually men, can be attracted to either both sexes. So what's interesting is within this working definition, it's either defined as the fantasy or sexual activity. So there doesn't have to be an act for somebody to be considered a pedophile. And there is treatment available. So if somebody were to be seeking therapy and they're disclosing to their therapist sexual fantasies with prepubescent kids, then they might have pedophilia. They might get diagnosed, and there may be that, since they're in treatment, they may be able to get some rehabilitation, some support with what to do with their actions. So it doesn't always mean that there's going to be an action, and it doesn't mean that there isn't. So lots of different things happen. So it could be somebody 16 years of age or older, and the victim has to be under 13. So does that mean that every molester is a pedophile? What do you folks think? Since we just went through the last one. Yeah.
I feel like probably most molesters are pedophiles, but I mean, there's situations where I don't like gang rape, someone getting mafia type situations where someone might be seeking revenge for some other sort of reason, other than actually being attracted to the child. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking, but probably, like most of them, I would think are. In order to do that.
Is like when someone is an abuser, they're often doing that for power.
Yeah.
So in a pedophile mind, are they doing this for power or is it different?
Pleasure.
Yeah,
So then
it's
I would
attraction.
say that no, because there's different ways of harming people and different reasons to harm. So.
Mhm. And I just pose the question because it's just something to think about. And we're in a pretty small community here. So we've seen lots of different situations, different circumstances, and I wouldn't say that any two are exactly the same. We've never worked with two situations that were the same within two traumatic experiences. People always have different reasons for harming another, whether that's their own traumatic background or their own psychiatric disorder. So it's something to think about, just interesting to me. So incest. So historically it's used to control bloodlines. So if folks have any history backgrounds that might sound familiar. Also things like, the King of England back in the day. That was a big part of it, the story of King Arthur and how those things came to be. A lot of that talked about royal bloodlines and maintaining the royal bloodline. And so that's kind of where incest started. However, now it just happens, I'd say, with folks that we work with, there's quite a bit of traumatic experiences, depending on the nature of those relationships. And then sometimes it's kids that are being curious with each other as well. So it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily consider, consent. So I bring this up because I read this article, and to me, it's something that's not always talked about when we're talking about incest. It seems like this really big, stigmatized, traumatic, harmful thing. And so what does that mean when two people are consenting to an incestual relationship? So in this situation, this is our article, and I won't read it out word for word, but these two folks are twin brothers that have publicly come out as lovers and have been engaging in a sexual relationship consensually for some time.
That's not true. Yeah, that's not true. I would check the source.
Why?
Is this almost?
I don't know, this just looks like clickbait to me.
Yeah, the stuff on the side is like, okay.
No, I heard the story in the news.
Well,
It's, I mean, even if it's not true, I think
It's
it's
still
like
possible.
good
It's
food
sort
for
of
thought.
It's
what I
really
think
just an
is
example. Yeah, thank you. So whether or not it's true, it's certainly possible, right?
Well, then you hear about all the like women twins that are doing things for.
Right.
Well,
That's
another
normal.
one that
just,
That's
it's
normal.
fine.
That's fine if they're women, yeah.
Another one that came into the news that the people actually got arrested was a stepfather married his daughter, his stepdaughter, and then the daughter posted on Instagram all about it and then got pregnant and posted on Instagram and she got arrested. So it's prevalent, it happens.
But we'll live life to think that has something to do with it.
So what's the question?
I'm just interested in what people's thoughts are. So, if this isn't hurting folks, and, we talk about incest as this big, harmful, traumatic thing, largely, and it's illegal, how does that come into play with consensual relationships? Is that still illegal? Should that be illegal?
This is a victimless crime.
It could be.
Yeah, because they're consenting to it, but it's still a crime. But it's a victimless crime where there's very few of those, I would say.
Well, who decides it's a crime?
The law.
That's what the law says.
Yeah, but where does that come
Well,
Right.
and then like you have to consider like children being involved in this too, like starting from a young age. Like dad's like what's it called when they like train them to grooming? Thank you. When he's like grooming them and then they become an adult and then consent to it. That's, I don't know.
I think that's different than the sibling thing, it's like there's a power thing and.
Well, yeah, and these guys look older. They look well above the age of consent, but.
But that also
This is an Abercrombie ad. But Abercrombie's old, so it's like new information now.
I think it's a bit older. I read about it like a few years ago.
Rest.
Yeah.
What happened to the parents?
I can
Are the
simply
parents
tell.
upset?
So why did they come out supposedly? I mean, I don't know much about the situation. I just thought it was interesting and something that we should be considering when we're talking about incest as well. Is that there's so many different situations, right? It's something to consider. Is that what does that look like? And as you mentioned, there's siblings and then there's parents and kids. With parents and kids, there's an inherent power issue, so that that's very different. But the same would go for an older and a younger sibling potentially. So something to think about.
I just read one of those
I
things.
know. I'll get out of this one. It's a little too strange.
Well, if mom's not that
So moving on, child sex trafficking, commercially sexually exploited children. So children cannot consent to sex work in the U.S. And then within that, they can't even consent to sex, right? From what our working definition is within the state of California, based on certain ages. So what does that look like? And it's any commercial sex act. So I think a lot of times, what is most commonly thought of with sex trafficking is somebody who may be considered a pimp with other people working for them who's getting lots of money for this, or getting some money, or getting something, and they've got control over these other people. That's kind of, I'd say, the most generalized model that people think of. However, when we look at sexual exploitation and commercially sexually exploited children, that could look really different. So like as you mentioned with the softball coach, what does that mean if the softball coach says, well, I'll put you up to bat for the next 10 times if you sleep with me. So that's coercion, and that's an exchange of something, right? So technically, under the definitions that we have, that could be considered commercial sexual exploitation. Something else that's important is that it's different state by state, even though what we know within the law is the same across the United States as far as commercial sexual exploitation. Sorry, it's a mouthful. So those are also different by states. Within California, they've just passed a law that a minor cannot be convicted of sex work. So before that, and that was that last year, year before?
Last year, I thought it was.
Last year. And this is in California, a progressive state. So as you can imagine, most states do not have that protection. So we have district attorneys that are still prosecuting minors for sex work, when underneath the federal definition, they are being sex trafficked. So inherently, their sex work is sex trafficking. However, they're being prosecuted and criminalized within. So what California has done to combat that is, one, they changed the law so that can't happen. And two, they started funding district attorneys, and they started funding offices and funding different programs so that there's support for those folks that are being picked up and district attorneys are looking at pressing charges. Now there's a process that instead of law enforcement taking them to jail or taking them to a juvenile detention facility, they're taking them into foster care, they're taking them into child protective services. Now, of course, those are two different, institutional models, so what you think the benefits are can be subjective. But now we have folks that are not getting criminalized and penalized for being coerced into sex work and being taken advantage of. So look at the numbers. These are just some statistics of what we see here. 300,000 and 400,000 U.S. children are victims of the sex trade each year. So that's no penny in the pot, right? That's a lot of kids that we see. And that can include juvenile pornography, street prostitution, and selling sex at school. So more than half and nearly 3/4 were first raped before their 18th birthday. So these are a lot of folks that have experienced trauma. So that's been a big part of their past, a part of their childhood has been traumatic, and then has brought them into a sex trade industry. You can see that a survey of men revealed that 14% have been forced or coerced before they were 14. So that's just within the men. Strangers were the offenders in only 3% of sexual assaults against victims under the age of 6. And 5% of sexual assault victimizations of 6 through 11. So that leaves the rest. That's what, 90+% of folks that are experiencing child molestation, child sexual abuse. Those are folks that they know well. And so that's why it's important to have those conversations, and those are a lot of the things that we do when we're working with youth and working with parents, is we're talking to them about what are the red flags, how to make sure that your kids are safe, how to have those safe conversations. and what does that look like? I will say that, and then, so 66% of all prostitute sex workers were sexually abused as children, 2/3 by fathers, stepfathers, or foster fathers, and 10% by strangers. So these are important things to think about, because I'd say within the field, within this industry of sex work, it's a lot of traumatic experiences, and people will become very vulnerable. We're working with youth that are already a vulnerable population that have experienced a trauma. And so a big part of what we want to do is build that resiliency and give them the opportunity to survive beyond their trauma and thrive beyond that. And it's interesting, within folks that have experienced trauma, a lot of times they don't have the ability to really differentiate safe environments. So I'd say a lot of conversations that I've had with parents who have experienced sexual abuse themselves is this feeling of, right, their trust has been taken away. Their most personal space has been so violated that they don't have the opportunity to trust individuals and to feel safe just in the community at large. So a lot of those conversations are parents asking, how will I know who I can trust? How will I know that my children are not going to be abused by other folks? Because in their experience, they didn't have that opportunity. So what we want to do is build that opportunity for them. So talking to their families about those red flags, about what safety looks like. And that looks different for different folks. So the grooming process, as you mentioned, some warning signs. Usually happens under this disguise of love or attention. So there might be gifts, building trust. It might be intentional and premeditated. It can occur during bath time, during bedtime, watching TV, wrestling or tickling games. And they usually, sexual abusers are using this opportunity to touch children inappropriately. So if you look at all of these things, and I don't put this up here to scare people, because I mean, my first thought is like, oh my God, that sounds terrifying, right? That looks like all of these really just regular situations. That doesn't mean that everyone who buys a child is grooming them. These are red flags to consider when it's really out of place. So when it's something that's kind of inappropriate, and that can look a lot of different ways. So it's not like when grandma's bringing over another toy, right? That's a normal relationship. So it's looking at those normal relationships versus abnormal places. The neighbor comes over a lot during bath time and has tried to bring over a bicycle this time. That might be concerning behavior, something to talk to the neighbor about, right? That might be a red flag to consider leaving your child with that person. So those are the kind of things that we can talk to folks about how to be aware of their safety, of their surroundings, of the people that are around their kiddos, things like that. Folks have questions about that?
Just reminds me of the time that a neighbor came over and wanted to give us money randomly, and my mom's like, "You do?" Anyway, sorry, just trying to.
Sounds like your mom
Yeah, no,
was being
my mom's
protective, did a great
My
job.
mom's boss, yeah.
Yeah, see, exactly. Those are the things where it's like, if you have to stop for pause, that's something to consider. Like, take into account your instincts. And folks don't always have the opportunity to have those instincts because maybe they hadn't experienced those normal relationships.
I heard something, they were saying like, if someone's more interested in your kid than you are, then that's a red flag, that's something that's not right.
Yeah, and I think it could be. It depends on those relationships. Depends on who it is. If it's, grandma or grandpa, it's their first grandkid, maybe that would be within normal parameters. Or, somebody who's works with kids, a lot of times they're really excited to see kids.
Yeah.
So it depends. But yeah, that's exactly. So just something that makes you think, like stops to make you think like, oh, this seems strange, or makes you feel uncomfortable. Those types of things. So some warning signs that that a child might experience. This must be love. This must be what love feels like. And when we look at these grooming signs as well, right, as we're talking about the difference between different types of relationships and appropriateness, these are things that you can see, folks that maybe don't have as many opportunities or have as positive relationships with their family members and family support systems would be particularly vulnerable to these types of warning signs, to these types of behaviors, to these types of grooming processes. And what we see within the children's program, what I've seen, is that typically, particularly in this community, what that looks like, that could be not having an opportunity to have childcare. There are virtually no childcare providers out here. So if it's between going to work and leaving your kid with a sketchy neighbor, and it's the only thing you can afford, these aren't always options for people. So I just want to put that out there, that while we're talking about these things, it's not always an option to everyone. People may not have the choice to not work or to have another childcare option. That might be it. And so when they're thinking about it, they might be turning a blind eye, or they might not notice, or they might not think about it, or, there's so many other situations that are taking place as well. And so again, when we're thinking of the folks that are particularly vulnerable to this, to sexual predation, predatory practices, then it's those folks that don't already have strong, loving relationships. They might be looking for it in other places. They're looking for that love and attention, so that's what it's concealed by. So kids are responding to that, and so if they're not getting that in other aspects of their life, that's a really positive outlet for them. So again, that's a big part of what we're doing in the children's program, talking to parents about having those positive relationships with their kids, trying to build that love and affection and have an attachment to their kids so that they're not looking for it somewhere else. And some kids enjoy physical closeness and are not getting that in their own immediate family or immediate surroundings. And then that's where they might be looking for someone else, or they might look for somebody in a different position to help fulfill that need. So these are some of the effects that we know that kids experience. So it's really confusing. Obviously they're kiddos, and a lot of times, depending on their age, this might be their first sexual experience, is sexual abuse. So it's super confusing. These are things that, as parents, we either a lot of times don't talk about. We're not talking about genitalia, safe sex, safe touching, those kind of things. And so to not ever have had a conversation or context to it, that's really confusing. All of a sudden there's this relationship with this person. They might not know if it's wrong or bad or what that feels like or looks like. So they might have a really ordinary relationship when there's no sexual abuse taking place. And the way the community views the abuser. So who is this person? I'm sure that everybody here has heard about, a lot of the priests in the Roman Catholic Church that have been moved around. So how is that going to feel for those kids that have been sexually abused by people that are revered in the community, that are looked up to? It can be a really confusing experience for them. So might feel bad. It must have been an accident. They didn't mean to do it. Trying to make those excuses for the person in their life that they might have a good relationship with otherwise, and they don't want to think that this is a negative thing. And they might feel like it's their fault for having that negative reaction, like, oh, well, I'm the one who feels bad. This person feels okay with it. So not knowing about that. And then, of course, as we know with other sexual assault and domestic violence, there's that stigma and the fault. A lot of times they feel like it's their fault. They asked for it. And part of that's because we don't talk about these types of things often. So adults never doing wrong. For kids, really specifically those young kids, they're looking at adults as their protectors. It's our job to keep them safe, which is what these regulations and laws are that we keep talking about. And so when somebody breaks that trust, it's confusing because the adult world was supposed to be trusting. So now it's a different situation. Conversations we have with parents as well. It's talking to them about how to have conversations with their kids, how to build those relationships so they're positive with their children, and so they're not seeking that out, and so that they can have some idea of what's going on in their child's life and making sure that they can have that connection to them. So preventing it, so includes reporting things that are concerning, those red flags that we see. So when it's that person who is way more interested in your child and that neighbor that's trying to give them money, making a report. Maybe that's somebody that has abused somebody else as well. And a big part of it is shifting cultural norms, of course, because it's stigmatized. We're not having a lot of these conversations. I will say the most common response I get from parents when I ask them what kind of conversations they've had with their children who have experienced sexual abuse, their response is, I don't feel comfortable talking to them about it. So I have none, had none. So here, a lot of times we get parents and children that have had no conversation or no dialogue about sex, safe touching, any of that. And it's really confusing for both of them. And they don't know how to have that conversation. So part of that is shifting our cultural norms, educating people, educating parents, our communities, access to mental health services for kids, for parents, for families that may be struggling, and obviously for folks that have experienced different forms of abuse. So having that support for them so that they can move beyond that. Community support. So again, trying to reduce that stigma by talking about it, and supporting folks, recognizing that while it's not normal, we want to stop this from happening. We want to be a supportive community, and move past that. So as an adult, what can we do? If a child even hints, then you can encourage them to talk freely. Again, when it comes to the criminal justice system, that can be kind of tricky. Excuse me. Thank you. Because that information can become evidence. So what I will typically do with parents or folks that are reporting it is have them report it right away. And part of the reason for that is because law enforcement is going to go through a whole criminal investigation. It's different than the Child Protective Services process because it's a criminal situation. So they do a whole investigation that includes forensic interviewing, and all of the information that the child shares is going to be evidence. And so the way that they're sharing and the way that people are asking questions, if folks are coaching them, then that can be inadmissible. So things can get thrown out in court if folks start asking certain types of questions. So ideally, if something happens, you want to let that child share what they feel and report it as soon as possible to get that information to the forensic interviewer in case charges need to be pressed. Yeah.
Would you want to record it, or could you just tell them what they said?
I've never recorded it. You can just tell them what they've said. So as mandated reporters, that's part of it. Excuse me. Thank you. Is just sharing what was said, and that's going to be the initial report. And then beyond that, anything that's not, they just don't want any prompting.
Right.
So they don't want people to say, "Oh, did Billy touch you on this day?" And then this child thinks, yeah, that happened. Right. Yeah. And so now all of a sudden it's a leading question, and they may start building memories that weren't accurate. And there's a whole interesting history of psychology behind that. Yeah.
How easy do children speak up if they have been abused? Or is it really across the board?
I'd say it's really across the board. I'd say the most important part of having a child report is having a trusting relationship. And so that's why so much of what we do is working with parents and encouraging them to have a trusting relationship with their child so their child feels comfortable talking to them about it. Inherently, the parent-child relationship is the strongest. So if they can build that relationship, that's going to be the best. Then beyond that, as community supporters, so as teachers, as therapists, as coaches, all of us that are mandated reporters, continuing to build those trusting relationships. That's going to be kind of the most significant.
Because I'm just thinking, if the child confided in someone and then you have to go above, to the higher up people, then maybe they're afraid. So then when you're asking them to tell something, which is now coercion, you're like, okay, and then the kid retreats, or if that happens.
And that's why it's also important to report it to law enforcement, because the way that they structure it is very different from a sexual assault investigation of an adult, where the investigator can ask these questions and we're assuming that adults are just forthright and sharing information. With children, what they're doing is they bring in a specially trained forensic interviewer, and that person has expertise in how to ask non-leading questions. So what that also looks like is there may be no outcome. They might close an investigation because a child is not sharing information with the forensic interviewer. I've been with families where the parent says, my child said this person touched them, but they didn't share any information with the forensic interviewer. So they can't really pursue an investigation. Does it mean it didn't happen? Nope. But there might not be a next step. So then that might be just getting that child into a supportive place, into some therapy if they would like, helping that family with what their needs are, safety planning. So making sure that that child's not exposed to that person, and continuing to support the family as much as possible.
I was a substitute teacher for 5-7 years or so in Truckee and Tahoe, and I had a student, she's like 5 years old, tell me about abuse in her home, and she had only known me for like 1 day. So it's, if they trust you, they will tell you, and like your response is really more critical than like your questions. So, that was kind of intense.
Yeah, and your mandated report has.
And I made a report, and so that was kind of scary. I mean, you don't really know what happens after you're reporting. That's kind of the awkward side, I guess. You want to know what happens, but yeah.
It's a great example of how important it is to have those trusting relationships.
Yeah.
And so that kiddos are feeling comfortable, so that they have lots of places to share. So it's not just one place, it's a lot of places. Yeah.
So if that situation that we were just talking about happens and the child doesn't talk to the investigator, is that person still are they like on watch or whatever? No? Not on watch, but like, is there a record of any report being made against them?
There's a record within that county division. So that's pretty.
Not a conviction, but just a record that they've been reported, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so those are those things where maybe the DA is seeing this name come up like 4 or 5 times.
Right. Okay.
That's when, whether or not there's an outcome, they might start pursuing or change their course of investigation. Because that's a great question, because then, what does that mean?
But that wouldn't be like public information, right? Because it's not like on a docket or anything, so.
Nope.
Yeah.
They're just internal.
I know it's really tough that I always was hard to grasp with that, if the kid doesn't divulge any information, like, it's hard to prove a touch,
Mm-hmm.
And those can be so detrimental to children, especially if they happen a lot of times, and it's like, somebody could know the system so well and know a child so well, depending on the different relationships, that it gets so predatory that it's like they're just touching and they know that they're going to get away with it, which is super sad.
And scary, and that's why, that can be why it's so important to report it immediately as well, because in certain cases, right, maybe it's been a week, and so now the person who was harming that child has had the opportunity to coach them. Oh, if somebody asks you, this is what you're gonna say. So within the investigation, they're trying to get that interview as soon as possible. So they do, and law enforcement does quite a bit of safety planning with family as well, making sure that they're not having contact with that person. What does that look like for the individual? And so these are just some things that we can do. So believing them, supporting them. Like you said, having that supportive response was the most important thing, is continuing to be a supportive person. Not necessarily what we're asking them, but just making them feel loved.
Well, once the parents think someone's gonna find out, they'll tend to move, I think. It's maybe a pattern you could see, like a family that moves around a lot.
Could be.
Kinda.
A pattern I've noticed too is the parents or whichever party is the abuser, dad or mom or is they cut ties with people, families, friends really suddenly for no reason. And they won't talk to them, you're not allowed to see them, you're not allowed to hang out. They still are in the area, but they will do everything to stay away from the person. And so if that consistently happens with people who seem to be fine, they're friends for years, and then just something happens out of the blue, and it's just continuous. So if someone can't.
I think that's a great example, and a big part of like that overlap that everybody saw the wheel of power and control. So that isolation component, so many of those things are playing out as well. I think put in everybody's packet, we have a wheel of nurturing children and abusive children. So it's like similar to the power and control and healthy relationships, but with children and within families. And so that's that overlap there, that isolation that maybe the parents or people who are harming are taking into account with the folks that they're harming. So let's take a break, and then we're going to talk about more child abuse. So, a short video, it's 14 minutes, so it's not that short. But I think that this is an important video for a few different reasons. One, this is a video that was released by the District Attorney's Office in response to supporting child victims of domestic violence. So this was released the year that they started including children on police reports that are exposed to domestic violence even when the child is not the victim. So that's important to think about, because that meant that the state started recognizing that the impacts of domestic violence were significant for kids. And so now they started recognizing the fact that kids that have been exposed to it, not just as victims of abuse themselves, but witnessing it when one of their caregivers is being abused, is so significant that they have access to treatment. So I always preface that because I think it's interesting. It's something to think about, of how the state plays a role in supporting child victims and how we view that kind of support.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Maybe it should come after this, but what's the current thinking when parents use corporal punishment?
Let's get back to that one.
Okay.
This is a video about the effects of domestic violence on kids. Again, trigger warning, there is pretty explicit graphic stuff on here. So please take care of yourselves. If you need to step out, then feel free to do that. This is a video that we show to families that come in when they're interested in services for their kids that have witnessed domestic violence. And part of the reason behind that is because it can be important to understand the impacts of what's happening before moving on to talking about, okay, now what? So now, and it doesn't just, so the first part of it, I'll say it's a bit heavy on the actual impact before it gets to the part of like, okay, now what do we do with resiliency? So keep that in mind, that we don't just focus on how bad everything is. We also then continue to talk about how to support the family and move beyond that. So we'll go ahead and get started with it. We can watch this and then we'll keep going. I should probably turn this, well, it'll take a minute anyway.
Because of the way the brain works, you will always remember your very first roller coaster ride. Storing these new experiences is one of the brain's main jobs. In fact, your brain creates a mental blueprint of every new experience you have. A blueprint for any new touch is stored in one part of the brain. A blueprint for any new sound in a different part. And a blueprint for any new sight in still another part. But as powerful as that first roller coaster ride was, it can't compete with the lingering effects of your brain's earliest experiences. Although you have no conscious memory of this part of your childhood, it is these very first experiences that literally become the building blocks for your whole life.
Unlike other organs, the brain is undeveloped at birth, and it is waiting for experiences to shape how it will develop. The amazing thing about the human brain is that the younger you are, the more sponge-like your brain is, which is the reason that children in 3 years can learn language, can learn to walk, can do all kinds of incredible things. But the very same biological sponginess that allows us to rapidly acquire language is also the same sponginess that makes young children more vulnerable to trauma than older children.
We have the opportunity to do police ride-alongs to a domestic violence situation, and so this was actually the first call I ever rode along. It was dinner time, and they were having spaghetti for dinner. It was dripping down the walls, the kitchen table was overturned, and we had 3 children in the household. Looking at this whole situation at the time, we said, no evidence of physical harm, the kids are fine. We learned differently, of course. The boy in the corner was classic behavior that we see with kids who have had chronic exposure to violence. He would just completely zone out, numb out as things started to get scary. The 6-year-old little girl on the chair blames herself for what's going on, but actually it was 4 years later that we really appreciated who had some of the most profound or severe harm coming out of this situation, and that was the 6-month-old baby who was now 4.5 and had seriously injured another child in preschool.
It's literally the opposite of the way most people think about this. Most people think young children, they don't really understand what's going on and they're resilient. But the fact is, if anybody's impacted more severely, it's the younger child.
The brain is put together like building blocks in a sense. Those first blocks that go together are the more primitive area, the survival brain.
The brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, so that the normal development of the top part of the brain depends upon healthy development of lower parts of the brain. The top part of the brain, where you do all of your thinking, is the part of the brain that is most changeable, easiest to modify. But unfortunately, if a child has developmental experiences of threat and exposure to domestic violence, the lower parts of the brain will be impacted and they're harder to change as they get older.
He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. There was lots and lots of screaming in front of the kids, berating, putting me down, and they pretty much heard it all.
Children exposed to domestic violence, children who witness their parents fighting, literally are experiencing a state of fear. And when this happens, the systems in your brain that are involved in thinking at the top part of your brain are literally shut down. It changes the brains of these children.
My son has seen and heard a lot of the violent outbursts. He was experiencing night terrors, and that was probably his way of dealing with it, because in his waking state, he didn't know how to articulate at 2.5 years old. So it was coming through, when he was asleep.
When kids are chronically stressed, one of the problems that we see is difficulty in attachment, in bonding, because they're so focused on survival. It's hard for them to reach out and connect with others.
My oldest boy went through a stage where he would bully his younger brother and seemingly laugh in glee. He was not remorseful or had no empathy that he could actually make someone cry. Many phone calls of him being disruptive in the classroom. He was a very bright kid, but that's when I knew that he was heading toward trouble.
A lot of these kids get labeled as being, bad, difficult, defiant. This is a very natural response to their circumstance. What the child is doing is a survival strategy for them, but it creates behaviors that are very difficult in the classroom. When they're in a crisis mode, they can't learn.
The tragic reality of children growing up in domestic violence is that they end up with mental health problems at a rate higher than children who are actually the direct victims of physical abuse.
My mother was a victim of domestic violence. My father was an alcoholic, a drug user, and it's just a cocktail for a bad living environment for children. My brother, he looked like he was crying on his way home. Me not knowing, I was just a careless little 6-year-old, seeing him climb up to my mom's medicine cabinet. I asked him what he was doing, and he boldly said, I'm killing myself. 8-year-olds don't talk like that. The first person I thought to call was my best friend's mom. By the time she came down to our apartment, he had a butcher knife in his hand. He was just cutting himself all over his body, and I was just bawling, just crying. There was nothing I could do to help. My brother was crying. He didn't want to be there. He was trying to run out. But I had already known that my home, wasn't my home. It wasn't a place where I felt safe.
Childhood exposure to violence is about living in a threatening, scary environment that may escalate to physical violence, but it often doesn't have to. It's the chaos, the uncertainty, the fear of being in a home where things aren't okay. Very interesting talking about the roller coaster because that's what we hear from adult survivors who are in violent households and also the children. The hard part for them, I think, is thinking about what is normal instead of this up and down life of being in a violent, threatening relationship.
Growing up in my home, there were 6 children. My mother and father, unfortunately, fought like cats and dogs. As a result of that, 2 of my brothers ended up being batterers. I have 2 sisters. Even today, they date men that batter them.
Exposure to violence is a lifetime legacy. We see that adults who have had negative childhood experiences often have coping behaviors that can be unhealthy. That certainly has huge effects on how one is going to parent.
It's really important for parents to understand that their internal state, whether it's calm, or whether it's alert engagement, or whether it's frustration and anger, or whether it's sadness, depression, the baby absorbs these internal states.
I have been in the moment with that sense of helplessness and hopelessness and stress and anxiety and rage. It really damages the brains of small children to be under a constant level of stress and anxiety. Every day I hope that I haven't damaged my kid in any way.
They need to see from you as a parent how to deal with stressful situations in an appropriate manner. Being rational, not resorting to violence to deal with situations. Your children are going to learn how to deal with stress from you.
Luckily, my older son is verbal enough and is old enough now that we have conversations about how did it make you feel when that was going on? Was that scary for you? Yeah, and validating that.
The biggest thing that helps children exposed to violence is to be able to talk about their feelings, get those critical messages. It's not your fault.
Any conflict, I'm able now to stop before I add to it. I'm able to step away rather than trying to solve it at that moment in a state of heightened anger.
Just try not to go through it alone. If you have a strong support system and know what avenues you have available to you, in case you do need to get out. I was glad that we got help when we did.
One of the great things about brain science that we've learned is till the day you die, you have the ability to add new neurons in your brain, that the brain is more like skin in the sense that it can rewire and heal itself in the most important area, the cortex. We have the capacity to heal and do better. The biggest thing we can do for kids exposed to violence is how many healthy adults can they connect to.
I did a lot of my childhood in other people's homes, so I saw what positive relationships were about. I saw my friends were normal, they didn't have the rage I had. Seeing parents that were together, that showed affection. Home dinners where everybody sat together. Those are the things that I realized were important. And instead of being envious, I incorporated it into my life. I wanted to be a part of that.
I know school is what made a difference for me. The teachers, the attention I got, letting me know that I could be somebody and I could do something.
In fact, my oldest son, his teachers, all 6 of them were very instrumental in coming forward and providing him support when he needed. They allowed him to be homeschooled to give him time to heal.
The hardest part about being a parent now is trying to be different than how my parents raised me. Am I being a good father? What do I need to do to help you feel safe in your home?
That's the part, the brain development part, that I think we want him to know what normal is for us. And normal is having people who support you and who love you and who want to take care of you. And that we want that to be his normal life.
It's one of those pay me now or pay me later. And the truth is, children who are good at self-regulation, good at self-soothing, don't cry very much, and end up being, if you will, successful, are children who have had incredibly attentive early caregiving, which some people, unfortunately, think of as spoiling. It's exactly the opposite. Rather than spoiling the newborn, what you're doing is you are building in healthy self-regulation.
So those are the things that I want to create an environment for my baby where he gets the benefit of what I've learned from all these experts and also other parents. And believe me, they're experts too.
The most important thing that parents need to understand is that the brain of their child will become exactly what the child was exposed to. If you want your child to be kind, then you have to be kind to your child. If you want your child to be good at self-regulation and not lose their temper, you have to not lose your temper. And that's the beauty of the human brain. It is a mirror to the child's developmental experience.
Right, and so to me, that's a big part of what they're talking about, is like how to have those conversations too, and help them process that information, even if whether we think they know or not, but talking to them about it. So it's not becoming normalized. So we don't always talk about normal things, right? So if people are being violent with each other and we're not talking about it, that sends the message that it's normal. Any other folks?
Well, it's encouraging to hear that the brain can heal and change. I guess I already knew that, but it's good to hear.
I know that 40 years ago, when we had our first son, we went to this big camping trip around California, and we ended up at Mount Madonna Center when it was just being started. But we got to have a private interview with Tari Das, and as a brand new mom, I had all of those issues, which y'all know. If when you have your first kid, it's like, oh, how do I do this? And so I had kind of a lengthy question about that. And he's a teacher, a master from India, and at that time he hadn't spoken in 40 years.
Yeah, he hasn't spoken since 1952. Still silent.
But he writes on a Greece report. So he writes down baby's copy. And if you had to reduce all of the child care books down to 2 words, that is it. All you have to do, like as a first parent, is say the word shit. And you get it. This little kid starts walking, shit, shit, shit. But that really is the most important thing, that you model what you want your child to be.
Absolutely. And wow, what a cool story. You guys meet Harry Doss. That was great. He shared with you. That's awesome. And that's something that I particularly like about this video is so the folks that are in it, this is all very research-based, so there's a ton of evidence. It's not just folks that are like, this is what I think is best. There's neuroscience behind all of this stuff. For me, that's something that's helpful when we're talking to parents because it's more objective. So for those of the parents in the room and friends with parents, you may be familiar with how sensitive that is to talk about parenting. It can, it's an incredibly personal thing. And just like other relationships we engage in, it's something that we all get options. We all get to choose how we want to do that, how we engage in those things. So sharing just objective information is a big part of what we're doing too. Not saying, this is what you should do, because that can be people can be very responsive to that and not in a necessarily good way, telling folks what to do. Like, we always want to share just this is the information that is out there. And it can be very intuitive, and for some folks it might not be. So this video is something that we share with individuals that come in, and we'll talk about it. We give them some context beforehand, let them know that this can be a triggering video. And when we end it, we talk a lot about resiliency. Now, I know in this video that there's not a ton on that. It's kind of like the last couple minutes. They start talking a little bit more about healing the brain and how that happens. And those things are so important that it's not the end of the world. There can be significant impacts, and there are significant impacts on how we respond to those kind of traumatic events and how we treat them, and how parents are responding. Because that is, like you said, that's what people are copying. So if they're not having those conversations, then they're left to their imagination to think, what might that be? Maybe this is just normal behavior. Or we can have those conversations with our kiddos and let them know, there was, one of the characters mentioned, there was violence, and she talked to her child about it. How did that make you feel? That it's not okay, it wasn't his fault. And those are the kinds of things that can help build that relationship back, help the child heal from the trauma and learn healthier behaviors and learn how to kind of recover from those situations that can be really scary and impactful. So those are some of the things that we're talking about.
I was going to just mention, we mentioned it maybe a month ago, since you're from Santa Cruz, but the HeartMath Institute is over in Boulder Creek. And this is exactly points to that, which is, as the doctor said at the very beginning, these unconscious memories that you don't have actually cause the amygdala and the midbrain to be hypersensitive. And you can, through training, go to HeartMath and teach yourself HeartMath and start practicing that, because that can literally, your heart's frequency can actually then change the frequency of the amygdala, so you're not walking around in a guarded situation living in fear, and you don't even know why you're in fear. The fact of the matter is, if you've been exposed to these types of experiences these children have, that's what's going on. And we can see right now in our cultural consciousness or lack of consciousness, there's an awful lot of people in this country living in a very deep state of fear, and they don't even know why. But you can do something about it if you're exposed to training and actually learning how to breathe into your heart, which can change everything.
Cool. Yeah, and that's a big part of what we offer as well. I think what you're mentioning are some really common responses and symptoms of PTSD, and that's a big part of what we do in the children's program is connecting kiddos to therapists and to those resources that can help them manage those symptoms. So I don't think we use the HeartMath that you're mentioning, but we do try to use therapy and talk to them about coping skills and things like that to help them.
The nice thing is this actually changes, the internal physiology. So, mental is one thing, emotional is one thing, but when you actually get to the heart reprogramming the midbrain, which is what it does, as their little tagline says, a change of heart changes everything. And it so happens that the heart rate variability is the best predictor of all-cause morbidity and mortality, which is pretty interesting. So if there's one thing that would predict whether you're going to live a morbid life or an early mortality, it's literally your heart rate variability measurement, which everybody can measure very simply using a very simple tool. It's the same technology they use in fetal heart rate monitor. It's exactly the same technology. So it shows how you respond to stress, but most people are walking around, and who knows what type of trauma they've had. It could have been domestic violence. It could have been something else that's more innocuous than that. They don't know it, but they get triggered very easily, and they're living in a state of tension where they're on guard. So they get startled very quickly. They get angry very quickly. They're simply living in fear. And you can change that. Why the science isn't more prevalent and more practiced in kindergarten, preschool, elementary, high school, college, adults, I have no idea. But the science is very, I mean, it's at Stanford now. They use it, a lot of universities use it. Why it's not like in the cultural mainstream where people can start changing their heart so they can actually learn to live a life that's free of fear is stuns me. I don't get it.
I know. I mean, that was just, I remember when you mentioned it at first, it was like such new concept that I didn't even know of.
NASA uses it, astronauts use it to deal with stress of flight into space. I mean, so it's just one of those things I'm not sure why it hasn't quite come to a package, but it's there. As I said, just go to heartmath.com and you can get all the information.
Oh, cool.
That's pretty cool.
Well, we'll have to look it up. I know that our last therapist on staff she ordered some heart rate monitoring things, so I wonder if it was something to do with that.
It's probably the M-Wave.
It was. I set it up.
Yeah, there you go.
Really? Oh, cool. Thanks, Gavin.
There's hope.
It would be interesting though if we could, like, every once in a while we invite people from outside organizations to come and like train our staff or teach our staff about new stuff.
HeartMath for the whole staff, that's what they do.
That's what they do.
Absolutely.
We've got a whole page on kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
let's
it's
look into
cool
that.
'cause it's they've got programs on the computer, even on your phone as well. You can download it, but it's really cool, the programs they have for children that you can put on a laptop, and you can actually, by changing your heart, paint a picture on the computer or cause a hot air balloon to rise, fill up a product, all of these different things. It's, so the technology's there for the children to be able to really get it and see that, They can feel it, and certainly adults can feel it as well. I mean, I think the adults today probably need it more than most of the children.
Yeah, I guess it's an advantage of the thanks for sharing that. It sounds like we do have some of that. Yeah, and so those are all important things to think about when we're working with families. So when we're working with the parents that are coming in and sharing these experiences, we're talking to them about what those relationships look like and how to build that resiliency. So there's also a lot of research on building resiliency. So it's that difference when we talk about what's the difference between one person that has experienced trauma and is successful in life versus the other person who's experienced trauma and is not. Right? We saw one person in the video whose brother was really severely impacted, and he wasn't. So he was, well, not as severely impacted, but from what he was sharing, right? He sounded like he had built himself into a very successful position in life. He had a family, he was in healthy relationships. So what are those differences? So there's a lot of research that shares that some of those things include having those healthy relationships with different people. So if you can't have a healthy relationship with your parents, then building in healthy relationships with other people. So as he mentioned, he had healthy relationships with his neighbors, his friends' families. So some of those differences. And as I mentioned before, part of that research as well is that the healthiest or the most significant relationship a parent has under this type of research is with their parent and their child, the parent-child relationship. So whatever they can do to strengthen that relationship is going to build the resiliency of their child. It's going to build their ability to thrive beyond the traumatic experience.
Just a little bit to add. So you're talking about the mothers and the parents' responsibility in modeling for the kids, and I kind of feel like you know, the mothers are the first victims, then their kids are following suit, basically. But so the mothers have a bigger responsibility to heal themselves and to then help their kids, and that's important because they can validate their kids' feelings way more than anybody else can, and they were there with them, and it involves taking some responsibility, which is hard, and also breaking through denial, which is really strong. So I just, in my personal experience, like since I moved away from my family, I started to have more subconscious memories come, and my mom has never been able to validate like things that happened, and she just never really admits things. Like there's a lot of sibling violence going on in our household, and so, you know, that was from my parents too. They weren't physically abusing or anything like that, but it just seems like you need the right person to validate the feeling that goes together. And so if you're not getting that, you're not gonna be able to validate your feelings, talk through it equals healing. So if you guys, I just noticed you don't have like parent and kid counseling, but maybe it's just not on the sheet.
Yeah, we do. We include the parents in the therapy sessions for when it's appropriate. So, and part of why we don't advertise that is also our grant funding. They want us to very specifically provide therapy to just the kiddo, but we do include the parent in the treatment conversation quite a bit. And thanks for sharing your experiences. I think you bring up a great point of having that parent support can be so important, and that parent getting their own support. We certainly encourage that. I think a big strength of the organization is that we provide so many different programs to folks that are experiencing different forms of trauma and violence. So we do get quite a few parents that come in for services, and they're really focused on their kids because they are concerned for their children, but they're not ready to access services yet. And so as with our organization, you know, we support their decision, and that's their choice. So we'll help them get support for their kiddos. And over time, when they begin to feel more comfortable and they can see that their children are getting support, they'll start to engage in services as well. And we're able to provide that support for them also. So we do provide adult therapy for folks in services and help navigate that relationship as well. And I think that's a really great point of how pertinent that can be to have that parental support. And so that's a big part of why we are having these conversations with parents, so that they can have the conversations with kiddos. And what we're talking about with them is reminding them, for, you know, first off, they're coming in for services, so they're concerned for their child. So already they have that protective factor. They're already doing the best thing for their child. So they're already making a huge step. So trying to support them through that and letting them know that they're doing a good job. That's the first step to making amends or to moving through the healing process for a family. So we encourage them to continue to come in as they are able to work with them in whatever capacity they're able to. And so that's a big part of what we're doing as well. So witnessing domestic violence as a form of child abuse, again, because we're a domestic violence agency, I'd say that that is a fair amount of the kids that we serve in the children's program are kids that have been affected by domestic violence. So in California, they view witnessing domestic violence as child abuse because of the impact it has, the psychological, traumatic impact it has on kids. As mandated reporters, that's something we do report, and when we're working with adults and kids, anybody who comes in for services, we of course let them know that we're mandated reporters, so that's going to be the start of our conversation. And within the children's program, we work closely with Child Protective Services because the nature of qualifications for our program are things that are reportable. So a majority of things that folks are getting services for are things that Child Protective Services is also working with them on. So other states have different laws. It depends on where that happens. Has CPS come in here already?
They're next.
They're next. Okay. Well, I won't go.
Or they're in a couple.
Yeah, a couple weeks.
Couple weeks.
Yeah. Well, as they'll tell you, it's all based on where it happened, but it gets super complicated, so I'll let them share more of the complications. And it's interesting, you'll see that the structure is very different in each county. So what that support looks like is going to be different based on which county is working with them. So if a family comes in for services in Placer County, the response they're going to get if I have to make a report because a parent has disclosed to me that the child was witnessing domestic violence is going to be different than the response they're going to get from Nevada County. So that's the difference between even just Truckee and Kings Beach, which can be really confusing because we also have parents and families that have two households. So there's situations where a family, maybe mom lives in Truckee, dad lives in Kings Beach, and they were in Reno when it happened. It turns into a logistical headache. And getting access to services becomes really difficult because the whole process gets triangulated and each kind of CPS system will bounce it back to the next person, and that's just based on structural impacts. So that's also a really big strength of what Tahoe Safe Alliance is able to do to offer for services is that we try to work seamlessly within our region. So we're all very well versed at the differences in statutes and regulations between each county and state. So that's going to be the only difference in the services we're providing, or what those regulations are. But aside from that, we're helping those families that might be moving throughout counties or be affected in different counties or states so that we can still help them and not be impacted by a state line or a county line. Now in other places that could be a pretty big difference. Is what that impact is from witnessing domestic violence. That can even be hearing it. So if the kiddo's in the other room and they hear a physical situation between their parents or a parent's caregiver and somebody else, that's considered child abuse. And that's willful harming or injury of a child or endangering of a person. So, and you can see on the second part, if suffering serious emotional damage or is at substantial risk of suffering serious emotional damage. So you can report. Some of the complications with that though are when we're making those reports, it's like a lot of other things that we're talking about. If there is not that evidence, there's not necessarily going to be that follow through for an investigation or things like that. Now that may be positive or it may be negative based on the family's needs and where they're at. Sometimes CPS involvement is a really positive thing for them. And sometimes it can be a really negative thing for them. So it just depends on where that family is at and what their safety situation looks like. However, as an organization, we are mandated reporters and we err on the side of caution. I will always let folks know that. So when people come in for services, so much of what we do is building relationships and having healthy relationships with each other, with the community, with community members. And part of that is that trust and rapport. So we're very transparent about our reporting. That way they have that choice. So as you know, with the wheel of power and control, a big part of what folks may have experienced is not having control over the choices they have. So within that, they get the choice to disclose if they want to or not. Now, if they're not ready to disclose abuse that's happening because we're mandated reporters, we're going to honor that. That's still their choice. And that does keep people from accessing services. I wouldn't say often, but it does come up. That's a situation. So failure to protect laws, I would say, are not as prevalent in our community. because we tend to have a good relationship with Child Protective Services. But what those are, a failure to protect law is Child Protective Services saying that a parent is failing to protect their child, and this is most commonly used in situations of domestic violence. So an example, and this is not an uncommon example for this, man physically abuses his partner in front of their children, and mom hasn't left her partner yet. Right, and there's so many reasons why. Has anybody tried to look for housing in this community? I mean, that's a substantial impact for people being able to leave if they even want to. Financial reasons. So now Child Protective Services is called because law enforcement was cross-reporting. Maybe a neighbor called law enforcement. CPS works with mom, and then mom is assaulted again the next week. This time, Child Protective Services meets with mom again and threatens to charge mom with failure to protect her children from abuse. So I wouldn't say this is an uncommon situation, but what are some complications to this? What do folks think about that?
The trust of the children, because if, now you're threatening mom, so now mom's living in more fear, and the kids need that supportive base, even if it's not in a great place. She'll just get all of her resources taken away. It's like, it looks really difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, they don't have a trusting relationship now with Child Protective Services.
Or with the system, as in if you're the victim, now you're going to take my kids away. I can't get away because I can't find housing in Tahoe, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so what does that mean for reporting in the future? Their safety? Are they going to feel safe next time they might need to call 911?
Or will they?
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Does anyone think this stuff seems fair?
No.
To the mom?
The moms are being disenfranchised. Like, they're getting no support and they're getting all the blame.
Exactly. So, when we look at this situation, what I see is that there's two people, and one of them is being abusive, but the person who is experiencing the abuse is being punished, not the person who's causing harm. So that's odd, right? Why would the person causing harm not be the person who would be penalized for that? So it's something that we talk a lot about within the domestic violence field. I think this gets used differently in different locations. So in urban areas, CPS might be more threatening and use this quite a bit more. A lot of times they just have really big caseloads, and this is their method of keeping kids safe. Is telling, hey mom, you gotta get out of here, take your kids. That's it. That's all. That's the capacity maybe that CPS worker has. As opposed to, hey, there's a person who's harming, we're going to talk to that person, let them know that they could be charged with something.
Okay.
Right, and then see if there can't be either some behavior change or support or take them out of the situation instead of penalizing the family that's already experiencing harm.
It's kind of an extension of victim blaming.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a big part of the structure of what we see in our society is that those structures reinforce victim blaming so much. And oftentimes when we're working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, that's a huge part of our conversation, is letting them know that it's not their fault and that we're here to support them because it's so ingrained in so many folks. I'm hearing it from every different place that we can. A lot of times when people just close to friends or family, maybe they're not believed, and so we try to support that.
Doesn't it also get into the very uncomfortable conversation about what is assault and battery? You know, if the woman is afraid to press charges, but CPS comes in or law enforcement and sees somebody that's beaten up, black eyes, bruises, broken bones, it's still, to me, just unfathomable that the person isn't arrested and taken to jail to protect the mother and the children and is prosecuted.
So that is actually part of the law, is exactly what you're saying, and I don't know, I want to say it was in the 90s, 80s, I can't historically recall. But for that very reason, they did change the structure of the law so that the district attorney is prosecuting autonomously. So they're prosecuting regardless of what that person wants. That's another part of what we're doing when we're working with families or individuals, whether or not they want to press charges. If law enforcement has been called, that's not their discretion anymore. That's the discretion of law enforcement and the district attorney. So there are folks where they have requested to drop a criminal protective order and the district attorney says, nope, we're going to prosecute this person and they're going to jail, regardless of what their partner may want.
And we have brought that up at when the DA panel comes in, and we'll ask that kind of question, and you guys will see the response. And the response is, I would say, in some way, appropriate when they talk about they're there to prevent people from getting hurt, and they are there for the sake of public safety, right? So if they know this person's just going to keep moving on to the next person or keep doing it again, and they feel that way, it's all based off of discretion. They'll do it.
So say that they are pressing charges and the mother says they don't want to and it goes ahead. How long does that take? So then now she could become a bigger victim because
retaliation.
Yeah, so how long is that, like weeks, months to get through the case? I'm sure it varies, but
good question. It varies, yeah, right. There's so many things that are taken into account that I will say district attorney is probably going to be better able to answer. But just to share what we see, it just runs the gamut. So it could be a couple of weeks. We had somebody who her trial was recently heard after 4 years of the person sitting in jail waiting to be arraigned. And 4 years later, she had to go and testify. And she, at that point, didn't even want to. But that was the only way that he was going to continue to be prosecuted. So it depends. It could be a couple of weeks. It depends on the severity of the case. It depends on how full the jail is. It depends on what laws are changing, the criminal history of the person.
Yeah, it depends on even if they get prosecuted. Like we'll see undocumented perpetrators that will go in for very severe cases, but will just get deported instead of prosecuted and then deported, or prosecuted, put in jail here, and then that way, and they'll find their way back, and it'll just happen again.
There's so many variables. It's really interesting. But not always super hopeful, right? I mean, that's why so many folks we're working with are so frustrated.
Totally.
It's like we can't tell them what's going to happen or what to expect. We can only support them
who
through this
makes
process.
these silly systems?
Right? Who are these people?
We do, there's certain things that we are able to do as, I would say as voters, and then of course there are elected officials, so if we're looking at the actual structure, it's based on who we're voting for, who's in those positions, and how they're making decisions.
I think we should vote on the actual issues instead of for the people. So like you would vote on, or you could do a voting system for the penal system in terms of like, how should this be punished, and everyone's connected on the interweb, and so, but we're gonna vote for a person who you don't really know the way they operate or what they think or any of that, so.
Well, they're supposed to share it with us.
How could they even know themselves? It's like the denial is that the system is broken. No one's admitting that the system doesn't help, but at the same time they're saying the moms are not doing a good job. We'll take care of them over here in CPS, but I don't think the system's gonna take any better care than a mother who wants to.
So that's a great point. I think that, CPS support is subjective, and I'd say we're very fortunate in our community that we live in a small rural area where our per capita resources are a little bit better than they could be in those urban areas. So the support here does look a little better than it does when we work with folks that are from Sacramento, either as workers or have lived in the community. The response from CPS, from what I hear, is very different. So our CPS workers are coming in when they're opening investigations, offering support. They're asking about what the family wants. They're asking about what the family needs. As I mentioned, this is not doesn't happen up here as often. People that are moving up here from different communities that may have experienced domestic violence, I would say, would report this kind of situation much more. So those folks that are maybe fleeing from Sacramento that are coming up here and saying, oh, CPS said they'd take my kids. So we're able to offer more support, and I think that helps a lot. I was just at a meeting this morning, the Child Abuse Prevention Coalition, and our CPS workers for Placer County said that she gets calls now from community members for help. So they're calling her directly because they have a rapport. It's a small community. People know Viviana. And people are saying, hey, oh, you got a problem with your kids, call Viviana.
Which is so bizarre, because I used to work at an inner city shelter, and that would never, ever happen. I mean, CPS would show up at the door, and everybody would be like in their rooms, and they'd be like, I don't know who that is, and I don't want to talk to him, so don't let him in, And it's nuts to me, and it's great. Viviana does great work. CPS here is awesome.
Yeah. They are. I mean, she was pretty funny. She was like, I wonder, do they know that I'm with CPS? And so I just share that because I think that's just such a powerful and positive thing. And I mean, and this is my just opinion, the way that it should work is that people should look at that as a support option, not as another place of fear, particularly folks that are already experiencing fear, as mentioned. So moving into adverse childhood experiences, this is super relevant to what we do, and when we're talking about traumatic experiences, there's so many different forms and so many different outcomes from that. So the adverse childhood experiences is actually a study. Has anyone here heard of ACEs or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study?
We just heard it on watching the that study he was referencing. Are you going to explain to it what it is? Yeah, they referenced it. They didn't say what it was.
The ACEs scale or something.
I didn't go into detail.
Okay. I think it's super interesting. It's really interesting research. And so it's a study that was founded by Kaiser in the late 90s. And it started by a doctor who was working with a participant, who was working with a patient. He was a doctor. And this patient had significant weight loss. And so he was checking in with her about her weight loss and how she was doing. And that was a part of her health situation, her health maintenance. And as Kaiser, they do a lot of preventative work. So she goes and comes back and she's gained a ton of weight. And so he asked her, what changed at her next annual, her next physical. And she shared that she had this triggering experience, that somebody had sexually harassed her, and that had triggered the sexual abuse she had experienced as a child. So that's got this doctor thinking, well, if this is happening to her, I wonder how much of this is related to her trauma, right? And this is causing all these other just domino effect of health outcomes, of negative health outcomes from the trauma that she had experienced. So he implemented this study to survey thousands of people about their childhood experiences. And it's based on very specific information, very specific traumatic experiences. So what they do is they take that information. These are, so these are pretty much all of them. They're just worded in a question form on a form, and they ask folks what their experiences have been. So however many you have a higher number. So when people will say an ACEs score of, it's out of, I believe, 9 or 10.
He had 10.
10.
Yeah.
So out of those 10, how many has someone experienced? There is a direct correlation with a higher number with worse health outcomes. And as I say that, I just want to share that that doesn't mean that everybody who's had negative experiences is going to have these horrible health outcomes. I say that as somebody with an ACE score of 8. And when I first started hearing about it, it was shocking to me. And I thought, wow, does this just mean, okay, great, I'm just going to die early, right? Luckily, it doesn't. And there's all these other things that we can look at of resiliency and building resiliency in people, and all of these positive things that we can build so that kids aren't experiencing those negative health outcomes. So hopefully we can change the numbers. Hopefully we can change the research and change people having high ACE scores to being able to be equal to the rest of the population. And that should really be our goal. And within the children's program, that's what we're looking at. That's what we're doing. We're trying to offer those positive outcomes to kids that have adverse childhood experiences. So this is just a little pyramid. It sounds like you might have seen this already with your book. So this is just kind of like a logic description of what I was just talking about. So we see that all these adverse childhood experiences are leading to early death. So the more that somebody has, they're going into earlier death, disease, disability, and social problems. And first, it's going up this pyramid. So they're experiencing traumatic events, and that's leading to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. So maybe from PTSD symptoms, their responses to those traumas. And next is those adoption of health risk behaviors. So as a result of that, those coping skills, having healthier coping skills or less healthy coping skills. So maybe smoking, drinking, having risky behaviors in general. And that's what are causing the increase of disease, disability, social problems, and the increase of early death among folks that are experiencing these traumatic events. So when I look at that, what I see are really a lot of folks that are walking around with traumatic experiences untreated, not having access to resources, not having access to therapy that can help mitigate those negative adoptions of behaviors, right? So hopefully with early intervention, we know that we can reach folks before it gets to another level. We can talk to kids before they start drinking and talk to them about going outdoors and having positive coping skills. We can provide more healthy adult relationships. Those types of things are what are going to change the negative health outcomes. So how are we all doing, right? That's what always feels like it when we're talking about this kind of information. So when we're working with parents, what we try to do is really highlight that resiliency piece that I talk about so much throughout this. Because there is not as much research as there is of the correlation to ACE scores and negative health outcomes, but there's still quite a bit of research. So we can use that to talk about how we're building resiliency. So some kids are experiencing that the same traumatic event, and some are going on to be successful and some are not. So like the gentleman in the video that we were looking at, that difference is his resiliency. There's a lot of articles that call it different things, and I've heard there was like a TED Talk about grit, that people were calling it grit, which I thought was really interesting because they're like, we don't really know, but we do actually. It's called resiliency. And those things that are building that are those healthy relationships. They are having access to healthy coping skills, having access to therapy for treatments, support, different forms of resources. So the more access to resources that folks have, the more positive outcome they're going to be from those traumatic experiences. And so those are just the definitions there. And so these are the factors that are affecting it. And there are these, so there's a lot of things that we can build as a community, as individuals, and as a program. And there's also things that are affecting folks that we can't change. So maybe their genetic disposition. So it's very interesting. That's a component of resiliency, is that some people are just more able to be resilient than others. And that's certain things that are maybe out of our control. Other things that may be out of their control, out of kids' controls, are stress, safety. So if they're still in an unsafe environment, it's going to be pretty hard for them to continue to start building that resiliency. Getting them into a safe place is going to be really one of the building blocks. We talk about this a lot with many of the families we work with that are maintaining their relationship with a person who's harming them, and we're not ready to leave. Now that's still up to them. We'll continue to work with them and support them, but often we don't see the situation improve, unfortunately, because that stress and their safety is still compromised. And particularly with kids, then that kind of continues in their ability to bounce out of that situation. So some therapy for kids. And Joe, you wanted to, before I get to, I'm moving more towards therapy, I wanted to remember to talk about your question you were going to ask about physical.
Yeah, I was just curious, what's the current law about corporal punishment? Spare the rod, spoil the child, and the generation that Brian and I raised is, I was fortunate I didn't have parents that beat me, but I had lots of friends of mine whose parents beat them. Because that's what you had to do in order to change their behavior. It kind of makes me wonder about even what's going on right now. It's like, because we're the generation that sort of brought all of you into the world here, and it really makes me wonder. The other thing that makes it really a sticky look at all of this is the new field of epigenetics, because now it's not just the expression of the chromosomes and DNA, it's now it's behavioral and thought processes and mental impressions to the fetus. And even the mental impressions that the parents have before there's even a conception in terms of the impact on a new being showing up. So it's so pretty important to be mindful.
Absolutely. I think those are all really good things to think about and important and totally relevant to what we do. So you mentioned, what the current law surrounding corporal punishment is. There is, it varies by state. That's Welfare Institutions Code, which is what dictates what Child Protective Services reports to and what is reportable. So in the state of California, that's leaving a mark. So, and it's on the bottom. So you're allowed to spank your child on the bottom, but once you leave a mark, then it is illegal. Then that is child abuse, physical abuse. My understanding in Nevada is that you can hit your child anywhere, but you can't leave a mark. So once you
hit him
leave,
on the head, you won't see that.
Yep, apparently. And right, so it's interesting and I think totally relevant. Within the children's program, we the material and information we share is really, hitting teaches hitting, so we do not encourage that based on research. And if folks want their children to feel safe and loved, then hitting and spanking and those types of forms of punishment are not going to convey that message based on the research that we share. Now, other people subscribe to different things, and we will share that it's still their right if that's what they believe is the most effective method. As long as they don't leave a mark, then it is still legal.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't realize that. Although still, even if you don't leave a mark, but still, it's good to know that. Of course, I don't know who presses charges. The kids can't. I don't know. It's part. I mean, to me, it's domestic violence. Just like earlier, we watched some of the good TED Talks and the one Tough Guys 2, where children looking and playing violent video games. That to me is domestic violence.
Sure, it's exposure to violence.
Absolutely, it's conditioning.
That actually totally meets the requirement, the law.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. I mean, you have to have two characters on there. Back it out, and a child that's, either watching it or engaging in those two, you know, characters doing that. It's like, what's the difference?
Yeah. Quick story about hitting teaches hitting. I was nannying in Spain for a 3 and 5-year-old, and I'm putting the 5-year-old in the car, and she doesn't want to get in the car, and she slaps me on the face.
Wow.
And to me, like, face is a no-go zone. And I'm sad to admit that I, like, not hard, just slapped her back in the face.
Yes.
Yeah, it was just my reaction, like, whoa, what? And then I was like, how did that happen? And then a few days later, I saw the father hit her in the face. So, yeah, that's what.
Continues. Where were we?
In Spain.
My daughter's looking at her yet.
My daughter did that to me too. I was changing her diaper and she's standing up and just gazing out the window, and then all of a sudden turns around and like really smacked me across, and nothing anger, no emotion. It was just like she had seen that somewhere.
Yeah.
And we didn't even have cable or anything, so I don't know where she saw it. But on that, now we do have cable. You can't even watch a commercial without seeing violence. Even if you're not going to the rated R movie, they're showing you like the best part. That's the violence or
You're right.
the
That's true.
explosion, the pinnacle, and you know, you're watching 15 minutes of programming with 3 or 4 minutes of commercials back and forth. You're seeing a lot of commercials more these days than growing up, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a great point, example as well, and things that we also talk to families about is like the developmental appropriateness of responses. So when those things happen, that is developmentally appropriate for those younger kids that are still learning and exploring, that they're learning how to use their body, and their aggression and their physical responses are a lot of kids are kind of naturally inclined to try and hit things, they're grabbing things. I have scratch marks all over my body because I cannot get my baby's fingernails short enough. Anybody is, right? Those things are razor sharp. But what the response is. So then that's where they're learning their cues
Right,
from.
they're testing you.
Exactly.
What if I do this? What are you gonna do? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna endanger my life. Are you gonna save me? Kind of thing.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Every
Those
time
types
you
of
know,
boundaries.
yes.
And talking to them about it, about what's okay and not okay, and those learning kind of conversations can be really important. And we talk to the parents a lot about that as well. So that's a big part of what we're doing with our parent education when parents are coming in for services. So when folks want to come in for therapy, these are some things that we take into account. And as you mentioned, Joe, kind of those PTSD symptoms, a lot of, I'd say, probably all of the kids, because they've experienced traumatic events, are experiencing some of these things in there. They might be experiencing flashbacks, physiological symptoms, that hyperactivity. There's some really interesting research about kids in schools being misdiagnosed with ADHD that have actually just been exposed to trauma and they have PTSD. Kids are very vulnerable, and as we saw in the video, they're just sponges. They're soaking it up, so they're at this increased risk of these physiological symptoms of responding to their trauma, and their body is responding to that. So when we're working with them in therapy, this is a big part of what we're doing, is talking to them, talking to the parents about these things, making sure that their environment moving forward is a safe place to help them, to talk to them about that, and then working with them on mitigating those issues, those concerns. So when we do provide therapy, some things that come up, as I mentioned before, so setting treatment goals that are lessening symptoms of PTSD. So we get a lot of success stories from youth and kids that are able to use coping skills, use healthy alternatives to what they were previously doing. We had a great story from a young woman who was sexually assaulted, who was saying that she learned how to manage her symptoms when she was out in the community, she would feel triggered, and based on her therapy, she was able to control that, and it was really empowering for her. So super cool, and that's why we're doing what we're doing, to give folks that opportunity. So confidentiality is a big part of what we're doing within the organization, and then within therapy as well. They're set to higher standards with HIPAA and things like that. And being in a small community, that means that people have even more limited options, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we know so many people. So a conflict of interest may arise if somebody knows somebody else. So there's folks that we're trying to access services for that we have to kind of figure out what their best option is. So when families are coming in and they're looking for therapy, that's something that we take into consideration, that we're talking to them about what options they would like and what options are available to them. So some of the barriers, transportation, language is huge. In the entire area, Truckee, Tahoe City, Kings Beach, all the way to Incline Village, we have 2 bilingual therapists and a population of up to 50% of monolingual Spanish speakers in some communities. So that is a huge barrier to services. So anybody who speaks Spanish, who's interested in pursuing a degree, I highly encourage you to. There is a huge
You will get hired so fast.
So you would have your pick of any agency up here. There's a huge need. So I'd say that's really the biggest. Financial, there's a long list of therapists in our community, and of that long list, like 80% of them take private pay. It's really interesting. I know that we are in a wealthier community, but to me that just illustrates it the best, right? That there's so many practicing therapists that are taking private pay of like $150 a session. That's amazing that people can afford that. And mental health is such an important thing. And so when we're looking at folks that have experienced trauma, that access can be really challenging. So we have in-house therapists, Kristen being our newest one. Thank you, Kristen.
I'm gonna try to
Who's that sound? KP office has it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know, that's
So that's one way that we try to provide that support for the community. We work with families to offer services to whatever works for them. So if they're in a different part of the community, or if maybe the 1 or 2 therapists we have on staff becomes a conflict of interest, we can refer to another contract therapist. So we hold some contracts so that we have options. So it's not just 1 or 2 people that the burden falls on. Qualifying for services in the children's program, it is self-disclosed, and so that's important because folks have to feel comfortable talking about it. We have people who can be referred in and they'll say, oh, I'm sure that something's happened to them. And then the parents say, nope, none of that's ever happened. So they would not qualify for services. So I'll let them know, even if they're at risk of other things and they're in a lot of need, I'd probably refer them somewhere else and explain that to them, that that's a barrier, that we're not able to help them with that if they cannot talk about it. And part of that is because if they're not going to disclose as well, then we're not going to be able to provide that much effective support if they're not willing to share what has happened because of the trust of the relationship. Parental involvement. So this one is a gray area. If kids are over 12, they can consent for themselves for services, but we have to document why it would be some sort of conflict of interest to have the parents' involvement. So we'd have to document that maybe a child disclosed both parents are abusive or only one's in the situation, in the picture, and that parent was abusive and that's a conflict. And of course, at that point, CPS would be involved as well. So we'd have to document all of that before we could access services for that kiddo. Other than that, we encourage parents' involvement. So if they're coming in, we're going to engage them as much as we can. Talk to them about how they can have that healthy relationship with their own child. Because 1 hour a week with a therapist is not going to change the other 100+ hours that they're with their own child. That's going to have the biggest impact. So then to qualify, a child has to have experienced some form of child abuse. That we do have some exceptions for bullying as well. So bullying qualifies in California, and part of that is because of the significant impact that that can have on kiddos. And then in the children's program, what we do, we offer therapy, as I've talked about. We have groups, so different types of groups. I think right now we have a pet therapy group that's going to be starting in a week or so. So taking kids to the Humane Society, and they're able to engage with the animals and talk about empathy and reflections of feelings with the animals. So that's a really cool group. We do group outings. We have a ski day coming up where we talk about those coping skills and using healthy alternatives, engaging in our community, and parenting skills. So a ton of that. We work with parents a lot as much as they're interested in. So providing education to them. A lot of referrals. So we're making referrals to cover all of their needs. We're not just working with them on one siloed thing and then letting them figure out the rest. So we're going to make referrals to other organizations and networks to make sure that that family is supported with everything that they're looking for. And that's kind of part of what the case management is, as well as advocacy. So calling those places on their behalf that they would like us to. That can be the criminal justice advocacy. So for folks that are moving through the criminal justice system or CPS, we're able to work with them if that's what they would like. And our services are voluntary. So people are only allowed to engage if they want to. If they don't want to, we're not going to. And that can be different for other agencies to kind of think about, because other agencies are not voluntary. So they don't always feel the same way. Sometimes they want us to maybe pressure someone. But as coercion and power and control goes into that whole system we're trying to be not part of, we do not employ those tactics. But that's it. Are there questions?
So this is a really question, lots of questions. What happens, what should you do if you see something in public that is questionable? I can tell the story, it's short-ish. We were in San Francisco at a concert in the park, and there was this older man that sat down next to us, and we were sitting down next to a family with children, and he pulled out a bunch of toys and started playing with the children. And we thought that was strange, and then we walked away, and there was a father with his son blowing bubbles and inviting other children to come play. And that same man walked up and was playing, like we were all playing, you know, but then the man like touched a child. And I just I have felt guilty about not doing anything about it since, but I wouldn't know what to do because, you know.
Sure. I mean, I think that that's a common response that, you know, there's a ton of education and outreach of like, what do you do? You know, within the organization, we're mandated reporters, so that's during our work time. Outside of work time in your personal lives, reporting is at your discretion. So you can or cannot report. That's really up to you.
Would you call police or?
Absolutely. You can always call law enforcement or child protective services and ask them. They should be receptive. Sometimes they can, you know, give you a little pushback, but if it's something you're concerned about, I've called law enforcement plenty of times for things that just I'm concerned for another person, and that's their job, is community safety. So there's not really a lot of alternatives to that. If you feel comfortable in intervening, then that's kind of a call, your own call. it sounds like that situation probably would not be appropriate to intervene yourself. But those are those kind of things that we can take on ourselves. And when it comes to situations where people are causing harm, the more opportunities for interventions can lead to more positive outcomes, because there could be the opportunity to get that person some support. And a lot of times we don't know what other engagements they've had, or maybe nobody's ever said what somebody's doing is wrong. That's kind of just what I always think of, like, well, if nobody's ever said to them not to do that, they just might not know. If that's something that has been so normalized to them. So having those opportunities for interventions can be a really positive thing. Of course, they can always be a really negative thing, and people have really negative experiences with law enforcement. So I think that's at their discretion. I know within communities of color, there's a lot of pushback on is it really effective or helpful to call law enforcement in the climate we're in right now. And so I think those are the kinds of things to take into consideration. Because it could not always be the most positive outcome.
Right. And then see something, say something, like if you're like, you just did that, that would humiliate and draw attention. I don't know if that's a good thing to do, but.
I think assessing your own safety first, right? So like if you feel safe doing that, then yeah, totally. Like if somebody feels safe calling someone out, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but
I don't know if I would even be able to do that, but.
I definitely do. I make them feel as uncomfortable as possible.
I think that's good.
If they feel awkward by me calling it out, it means they know that they did something wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, as long as I'm not in immediate danger, I will call you out.
Assertive language goes a long way, right?
Yes,
People
it does,
don't
yeah.
always expect that, and so I think that can be a really powerful way to kind of stop that behavior from happening, depending on what it is. If it's something that's like, hey, stop doing that, or even in our own lives when people are doing things to us for sexual harassment, racist jokes, those kind of things. Having that assertive language can be really impactful. A lot of times people are just like, oh. I know when I share that, people are usually kind of taken aback. And then, they, oh, okay, I guess I shouldn't have done that.
I'd say like she would have been able to record it and then call the police or like take pictures. Can you guys do that? Can we do that, or would that be like not appropriate?
That is a great question. I'm not a lawyer. My understanding of the California law specifically is that you can't record people
Unless they know, right?
without their consent.
But if she would be recording and say, I'm recording you.
You better stop this. I'm gonna record you.
Yeah, like if you want to be blatant about it, absolutely. And if they don't want to, they can either stop or go away. But if it's in court, you can't use it. Like it's not.
So you could also say, like, I'm going to call law enforcement, or I'm calling the police right now.
Right.
I would have afford to break up fights. I'm calling the police right now, and that'll disperse people.
Right. It seems like a good strategy to get evidence against an abuser in your own, to yourself, that you could start to record what they're saying, or.
So there is an exception when it's for. There's an exception for domestic violence that you can record acts of abuse against yourself. It still gets thrown out in court though. I had an emergency protective order that got thrown out. And again, because the criminal justice system is the discretion of the judge. They can choose to implement the law whatever way they choose.
And thankfully CPS and law enforcement are coming up, so you can like talk to detectives and CPS who like actually have to deal with it. And they can tell you their experience.
Other questions?
Thank you, everybody, for your opinions on that. Next time, I need to work on saying things.
Well, the
Being
victim
assertive.
would not enjoy it, but you're speaking up on their behalf,
Right.
so then they know.
It was a
this isn't
small
right.
child, so I almost wanted to say something to the parents,
Right.
like,
And the way I look at it is I always try and find some support. So if like I'm with someone,
Right.
not going alone, or being like, am I seeing something different? And trying to get a little bit perspective before making your step. And then if someone else is like, yeah, this kind of looks weird, you kind of have a little bit of support in case something misfires, you know?
Yeah.
Intervention. Yeah.
Yeah, and safety is important. So
Right.
if you feel threatened in any way, like it's not going to be a safe outcome, I would go the service. But it's always your discretion.
Yes.
It is late. Thank you all for engaging.
Thank you.